apologies to those joining us online. So just a brief recap for the folks who couldn't hear this earlier online, we are going to have the 4 presentations of our speakers. I'll introduce each of the speakers in turn before their talk, and then we will take about 5 minutes of Q&A, and we'll be happy to read questions that are submitted via the chat. And then we will have about a half an hour for Q&A and discussion at the end of the session as well. So allow me to switch to our first presentation. Does that look good? Okay, great. So our first presenter is Carolyn White. Carolyn is the Mamie Kleberg, I guess I should have asked you how to pronounce that, chair in historic preservation and professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Nevada, Reno, where she's also the director of the Historic Preservation Program and director of the Anthropology Research Museum. Her recent research explores personal adornment as a class of material culture and a means for exploring the construction of identity along gender, class, age, and ethnicity. She's currently engaged in diverse projects on daily life in 19th century Aurora, Nevada, the transatlantic trade in personal adornment, the study of ranching on the Big Island of Hawaii, the exploration of Depression-era rural landscapes in the Black Rock Desert, and of course, most notably, the archaeology of Burning Man, published in her 2020 book. She also holds a PhD from by far the most illustrious institution, Boston University. So welcome back to Boston, Carolyn.
Thank you, everyone. Is the sound okay? Great. Well, thank you, first of all, to Mac and to Andrea for inviting me here. It is really touching to be here. It's also sad, of course. And it is just a wonderful coming full circle to be back as a person who graduated. Someone reminded me 20 years ago. So thanks for that reminder. I also wanted to give just a brief shout out to all of Mary's students, past and present, who are not able to be here today, who are far flung across the country and the world at this point. So today I'm going to talk about the materiality of the ephemeral, the short-lived, the fleeting, and this is a topic I think that every time I think about it has particular resonance, but there's nothing like honoring the too short life of a colleague, mentor, and friend in Mary Beaudry that reminds us of the fleetingness of pretty much everything. So I'll talk about my work on the temporary and ephemeral and on the role of active site archaeology in understanding the ephemeral aspects of daily life. But first, I do want to take a short trip down memory lane to just speak briefly about my experience of being a student of Mary's, what now seems like just a moment, but at the time did not seem like just a moment. So I first met Mary on the page as an undergraduate student when I started to dip into historical archaeology for the first time. And I found her work along with her colleagues in Lowell to be a true inspiration. Her work at Lowell introduced to me the potential of what historical archaeology could do. Bring the lives of the marginalized into the spotlight through careful, rigorous fieldwork and intensive multi-source analysis of material culture. Mary's written work inspired me to join the BU Field School at Spencer Pierce Little. And there I am being trained in fieldwork skills and was immersed in historical archaeology for the first time. After that summer, I was inspired once again by her to apply to BU to study with her. And I won't delve into the details of my graduate education. We can talk over drinks, but I would like to note a couple things. First was that Mary was a very tough advisor in all senses of the word. She was demanding, Her expectations were very high, and that brought out the best in her students. Mary attracted students to the historical program that were bright and motivated. I speak for my compatriots. And she matched those students with projects that enabled them to create their own niches within the world of historical archaeology. It was less of a let me hold your hand and more of a let's see what you can do with my observance. And another blast from the past. These are all thanks to Michael Hamilton. This is Mary and me and a colleague here at one of the many receptions that we had the opportunity to go to / were forced to go to as graduate students. So I'm going to talk today about ephemerality, about temporariness, and as Mac mentioned, I've been working on, oh, sound okay? More into the mic, okay. No problem. Is that better? You tell me what I need to do, Maria. That's always my best policy. So I've been working on aspects of the temporary, of the ephemeral on an overt basis for some time now through several different projects that focus on places that are occupied for very short amounts of time in various ways. And I'm going to talk about two of them today. First, talking about Burning Man, and then we're talking about my current project in Rome. And my interest in ephemerality and temporariness comes through in a variety of different ways. I've been interested in just thinking about what temporary places look like. How do people create public and private spaces, and how can we see them in a temporary fashion? And what do so-called temporary places look like? How do they look like regular domestic space in various forms? And in what ways can we see how these places then come together to form communities, and how can we see the social connections that transcend place? So my work in Black Rock City, Nevada, and in the Eternal City of Rome focuses on the materiality and physicality of urban living in two dramatically different settings. The Archaeology of Burning Man project was my first, what I call active site archaeology project. And this scale of this place was intimidating from the get-go, and it confronted me almost immediately with the inadequacy that we have as archaeologists to research places that are temporary and are large scale. So for those of you who do not know, Black Rock City occupies about 4.5 square miles in the Black Rock Desert of Nevada and has a population of nearly 70,000 people. The city is permitted to occupy the space from August 1st until about October 5th, and that includes all aspects of setup, occupation, cleanup, and removal of all of the debris from the surface of the playa that has been set on there by the city. The event of Burning Man lasts just 7 days. So the big question for me, and I don't know that I have an answer, was how do you even go about studying a temporary place of this scale? I started working here in 2006, and the trajectory of the research there has become a sort of launching pad for the examination of large-scale, ephemeral, and temporary sites. So methodologically, the time constraints of the project, the presence of active participants, the recurrence of the event meant that my archaeological methods had to be prioritized in a different way. So with this project, really the first step was getting my bearings in the city. And here you can get your bearings of Burning Man through a series of inadequate snaps of what the city looks like. But my job first was just simply to figure out what some of the key aspects were. So I was, those first years were simply laying down the groundwork, figuring out that this was a city that was represented by a clock with alphabetically named streets and streets named after the hands of the clock. I was also interested in just seeing the form and presence of institutional components, public spaces, the kind of municipal side of Burning Man, such as things like where is the information center, the medical tent, where are the law enforcement. And I was also interested in seeing these theme camps and the things that people built to kind of express themselves in various ways around love of Thomas Jefferson or other big installations that people would build out in the desert that they would then burn or gather up and take away. This is an image of one of my favorite installations of all time. This is a project called by everyone the Belgian waffle, but by the maker, the euphonium. And this was a massive structure that then was burned in pretty much the biggest fire I've ever seen. Of course, part of this is also centered around the man, which is burned, and the temple, which is also burned. These are the two big culminating events of Burning Man. So one of the things that I was just so interested to see at Burning Man was the way that organization and chaos lay alongside each other. And I started to try to figure out how we look at this urban setting and understand its different parts. And if you want the full details, you can read the book, which is out in paperback this month. But I began to focus on the cyclicality of this city. How do people live in this place? What are the material signatures of these spaces? How do we see private space, public space, intermediary space? How do those different components interact? And so you'll have to take a look at the book to get those full details, but I want to talk today about the cyclicality of a place like Burning Man. So I've been looking at the way the city is built, the way people live in the city, and the fall of the city. And with a temporary city like Burning Man, you're lucky because it happens once every year. This is the very first part of building the city. This is the Golden Spike ceremony, which happens in August. And this is where the full-time workers of the Burning Man organization gather around and they place the golden spike in the spot where the man will stand throughout the event. And it's a moment of coming together, of community. They even let visiting archaeologists tap the spike there in the center on this occasion. And it launches the building of the city. Right after that, they start laying out the city. And I have a big part of the book is kind of looking at how we see the colonizing of the space by Burning Man itself, how the smooth space is converted to striated space in Deleuze and Guattari's vision of space. And this is just a wonderful example of that. This is the DPW, the Department of Public Works, and they are going along and creating the boundary of the city. That is the first part of the city that is built, this big fence that encompasses the city itself. And during this early time at Burning Man, this is kind of the atmosphere in Black Rock City. It's a land of open space where people drive around in pickup trucks, where heavy equipment is everywhere, and where building is happening. So this is the spot where the Golden Spike is, and this is the platform of the man that is being built here. Now, the transition from that building stage into living in the city is not abrupt. It kind of gradually, the landscape fills in with individual houses and people build their domestic spaces here. So one of the things that I've been very interested in, certainly under Mary's tutelage, is looking at house and household. And so this is a 5-story condo building in Black Rock City. These are rentable condos. And you can see here, this is the inside of one of these beautiful rented spaces here at Burning Man. And so a big part of this project has been to just see what kinds of spaces people build in and how they live in these spaces. This is one of the camps that I looked at for over the course of many years, Sun Tracker Camp. I stumbled in here as a lost archaeologist early on, and I come to find out the people that lived in that space had kind of done my work for me. This was a real moment of what do I do if people have already mapped their spaces, help. But actually that was fantastic, because in a place like Sun Tracker Camp, you see the way that people live in that space during the day. We have this documentation of how they conceptualize their spaces, and then you see what actually happens. A few key elements here. The margarita bar right in front also doubles as the front porch during the day. This is a space where they serve margaritas every day at 3 o'clock. You have to bring your own drinking vessel. And the blender is run by wind power. So this is the front porch version of the margarita bar, where Bruce and Don are taking a nap. That is really how it's used for much of the daytime. And then it converts to this space every afternoon at about 3. But I was also interested not just in how people conceive of their spaces, but also the things that they aren't really that conscious of. And we know that that's one thing that archaeology can bring, is exposing the things that people don't think to talk about. So places like where people store things. I mean, storage is a fascinating thing for archaeologists, and in active sites, we can see where storage happens. You can see the tequila bottles, the water, the chairs that they will be setting up later on. And so looking at those different forms of housing and the ways they change through time has been a big part of this project. I've also, of course, looked at things like the temple. This is one of the big features in the city that is burned on the Sunday night of Burning Man. This is a particular favorite of mine. And this is another example of the man, a 40-foot man that is set up in a different way each year, and then is burned as the culmination of the event. So the fall of the city is just as interesting as the building of the city and the living in the city. This is that said man on fire. And I've looked at the ways that this cleanup happens, which is truly remarkable, because it goes from a city of about 70,000 people one day to about, maybe 500 the next after people leave. This is the place where the man is placed on the day after the burn. And you can see people kind of going through the debris, picking up melted pieces of glass and other debris, some to fashion into artifacts, some to just bring home as a keepsake. And then this is the playa. This is like 4 days after the event. So things get cleaned up really quickly, and what is left behind is piles of bikes, some stray porta potties, a few things that are left behind. But the cleanup process at Burning Man, where they essentially erase the playa surface of as much evidence of human occupation as they can, happens quite quickly. They take down the big stuff, and they do what amounts to a 100% survey. They walk each block, they call it mooping out, spreading out and collecting moop, the matter out of and gathering it up and maybe giving some of it to visiting archaeologists. And the playa then is restored to its empty status for the rest of the other 11 months of the year. So that project, in looking at what is the largest temporary city, made me think about looking at maybe places that were a little less thought of as temporary. But what I have really come to think about is the temporariness of everything, of course. We are here in this temporary building, on this temporary university, on this temporary city. And so I turn to what is thought of as the eternal city, the city that has been around, that we imagine as the longest lived city in so many ways. And that of this is the city of Rome. And I've used a lot of the methods that I've been using at Burning Man to understand another sort of temporary structure, that of squatted buildings. So drawing on the experiences at Burning Man, I've been interested in studying some of the different and challenging temporary spaces to apply my ideas for understanding ephemeral spaces through active site archaeology. So this is the site that I've been working on among several others. But this is a place that is at once a museum and a place of residence for a large migrant community in Rome. And in 2010, a number of people from Northern Africa, South America, and a large Roma community settled themselves here in Rome in what used to be a salami factory. And this is on the outskirts of Rome in a sort of industrial area. The building was abandoned and the residents created apartments out of the warren of offices and outbuildings that comprise this structure. So in 2012, a small group of anthropologists and activists connected with the inhabitants here and proposed to use the large unoccupied spaces that were too big, too messy, too dirty to use as art spaces. So it began with a series of installations of murals along the outsides of the building, and then now has turned into really this huge art center that fills the spaces inside. There are large art installations everywhere. Sort of every surface is covered with artwork, and it remains to be also the place where a number of people live. The curator of this museum, Giorgio De Finis, works with the artists and with a large group of people as well, with the inhabitants, to offer artists spaces to install in the museum, and they all must be approved by the residents who live there. Many of the installations are political in nature, and many reflect on the so-called migrant crisis in Italy, and the collaboration of the artists and the inhabitants has the effect of trying to make their situation more secure by creating kind of a front for the residents here. Now, the law in Italy states that evictions of squatters can happen when it can be proved that the value of the building that is being squatted has decreased because of the squatter's action. And so in this case, with these art installations, since they are physically part of the building, it increases the value of the building dramatically. And the presence of the art also means that should those inhabitants be evicted, this art being part of the eviction process will speak to the press and will create a more sympathetic vision of the lives of the inhabitants, as sad as that is. So the project here has been to focus on the physicality, again, of this space. This is one of the areas outside of the main building, but I've been looking at and working with a collaborator photographer to understand these spaces, just like looking at the tents and buildings at Burning Man, to look at the apartments that people set up here. And this is the apartment of a woman from Eritrea. You can start to see sort of the creativity and the practicality of some of these spaces. They show in many ways the same kind of ingenuity, creativity that we see at Burning Man, and also just simply making an uncomfortable space comfortable. And so it's easy to see these apartments as permanent spaces, but it's also really important for us to realize that the making of home, of household, can be just as impermanent to people that live in a place like this because of the political situation that they find themselves in. So active site archaeology then inverts our expectations of the archaeological endeavor, and ethnographic approaches to materiality in the past allow nuanced interpretations that are often inaccessible through standard archaeological practice. We see temporal scales and the impact of temporal conceptualization in a methodological sense, intersecting at multiple points in this work. And time, we see, defines a preponderance of archaeological work. The collection of data and its accurate relationship to temporal scales is a foundation of our archaeological research. So when we discard the idea, when the idea of the past as extant only in the irretrievable distance is discarded, as is what happens in this kind of work, it challenges our basic assumptions within archaeology. One of the things that I find most interesting about active site work is that we see the ideas about past, present, and future kind of coming together in different ways in these temporary or potentially temporary spaces. So this way that time and temporariness come into play is really interesting to see a active space as it's used in a point in time. Every one of these places is in the midst of a cycle of life. This apartment is inhabited today or was inhabited a few months ago or a year ago. But in these squatted spaces and these contingent spaces, people don't know how long they're going to be able to stay there. So there is this sense of imminent destruction. We just don't know when that might happen. Some people stay for much longer. They linger, they stay, they become kind of semi-permanent fixtures in these spaces. So the flexible and fluctuating nature of squatted spaces, of other temporary spaces, gives us the opportunity to really understand the role of temporariness in the ways that people live, and also forces us to think about subject selection, the effect of timing on data collection and the results, the fluidity of the present, and issues of what is absent in the present. So in studying a place like Black Rock City or like Mom, it doesn't tell us about the past ways of life directly. And I want to make clear that the site of Burning Man, although many people want to imagine it as this place of simpler, less complicated, more egalitarian, this is a common question, but the freedoms that we see there do not suggest a simpler past. What it does is offer us a critique, I think, of the ways that we do archaeology and the sorts of questions that we are answering in and how we can answer them. So when we study the present, it makes it clear that not only are the tools that we have as archaeologists completely insufficient for the task, but they're also the best that we have. So it's my hope that as people may start to do more active site archaeology, to look at these temporary spaces, whatever they are, it might help archaeologists to bring in some of that messiness that we see in daily life, the noise, the disruption, movement into their own interpretations of their sites. In the case of Black Rock City, this is a place where something curious is happening. Just like at Mom, these are sort of unusual spaces, but these are places where the rhythm of daily life is accelerated, and we might, as archaeologists, all imagine those similar roles happening at our own sites. In these places, I'm studying not just a place that is about to disappear, but I'm also studying places, in some cases, that have already disappeared. And I want to close with just noting that all cities are temporary, but some are just more temporary than others. So thank you. Any questions? Yes, Andrea. Yes.
So my question for you is to give those of us who don't have the benefit of looking at the now and who are stuck in the then, some pointers, some advice. What kinds of things should we look for?
I think, well, I love giving advice. Thank you for this opportunity. I mean, I kind of go back to the messiness. I think that, you know, one of the things, just thinking about Mary and the kinds of things that she taught me, was putting people at the center. And that is a thing that we can lose sight of as archaeologists, because of course we are not looking at people, we're looking at things. But I think also just this messiness and the way that there is no single point in time that we're studying. We're studying things that were left or accumulated. We're studying things that people who were still alive left behind and had a life somewhere else. And so I think those kind of interleaving, messy components are a really important part of understanding what happened in the past. And it goes back to some of the, you know, Pompeii principle and ideas about what is left behind and what activities actually leave things behind. I think that that's something that it's really important to think about. In my own work, I have also a project looking at a 19th century town in Nevada that was a city of 10,000 people, which seems big, except compared to Black Rock City. You know, 10,000 people one year, 5,000 people the next. I mean, 500 people the next. And those cycles of abandonment, we also have to remember that those are part of the life of that city. And just trying to imagine the spaces in between the material remains, I think, is just really critical. And I think pushing our imagination too, to really activate the things that people left behind. And that's certainly a legacy of Mary's, to think about things in a really active way. Yeah, and see the space between those things too. I think that's key. Yes.
All right. Bear with us as we work through the technical difficulties. All right, so our next speaker is Zoe Crossland. Zoe is professor of anthropology at Columbia University, where she's also the director of the Archaeology. Her research deals with the historical archaeology of Madagascar, archaeologies of encounter, forensic archaeology, and archaeological production of the dead body. Notably, she is also a co-author on the recent article in American Antiquity, The Future of Archaeology is Anti-Racist, Archaeology in the Time of Black Lives Matter, as a sponsor of the 2020 webinar that many of us were able to attend that is the focus of that article. So we're honored to have her with us today. Join me in welcoming Zoe.
that? Is that working? All right. Everyone hear me? Zoom and in person. Okay, thank you. So first of all, I'd just like to reiterate what Carolyn said, to say thank you to Mac and Andrea for inviting me to come here and speak today, and also to Maria, where is she, just for all the logistical help. Thank you. Thank you so much. So in that introduction by Mac just now, you'd have noticed that there's no mention there whatsoever of anything to do with witch bottles or early modern English archaeology. And that's because I came to this project a while ago now, when I was working as a postdoc with Sarah Tarlow on a project that was looking at post-medieval burials in England, in the UK and Ireland. And as part of that project, one of the burials that I recorded had a witch bottle in the grave with it. And that just, there was so little written about them at the time. This was back in the early 2000s. I became very interested in them and started researching them. So that's how I went down this rabbit hole and how I ended up speaking about this today. And in fact, that's how I first met Mary, was at the 2004 chat when I was in Leicester, when I was working as a postdoc on this project. So when I was asked to come and speak today, I was invited to speak on the theme of materiality and embodiment. And this is something I wrote on in the book that was edited by Dan Hicks and Mary Beaudry, the Oxford Handbook of Material Culture Studies, that came out back in 2010. And in that text, I developed a short case study around the phenomenon of early modern witch bottles, just sort of developing this interest that I had. And it's something I've kept working on over the years, but I have yet to publish in full. So this offered a very welcome chance to return to the project. And I hope here too, it allows us to see the field as process. Something's turned off the microphone. Is it working? Okay, okay. All the amazing work that's been done by archaeologists and historians since I wrote the piece back in 2010, and the increased insights we now have into the practices around these vessels. I'll be talking a bit about some of the historical work in this presentation, but I also want to acknowledge the important work being done by Kerry Holbrook and colleagues. Also Brian Hoggard's work, who's been collecting information on these materials for years now. And then most recently, the fantastic interdisciplinary project at the Museum of London that was headed up by Nigel Jeffries. So there's really a lot of work being done now on witch bottles. It's kind of an exciting time to be thinking and writing about them. Mary, of course, was very interested in questions of personhood and of self-fashioning, and her work often touched on 17th century English context. So it seems especially appropriate to be talking about these 17th century objects today, not least because they're often found full of pins and needles, and she even mentions them in passing in Findings, her book on the material culture of needlework and sewing. So I want to start today with this object, which was found during renovations of the Plough Inn in King's Lynn around 100 years ago, in the second decade of the 20th century. It was probably found just a few years after this photograph was taken. The bottle was buried just inside the threshold, where it opens onto the street, probably right under where this lady is standing, perhaps the pub landlady. It's typical of mid to late 17th century stoneware bottles, characteristic of many of the earliest witch bottles. It's a Bellarmine or Bartman bottle with this very distinctive face on the neck and the medallion on the body. And inside this bottle was a curious object, a piece of cloth cut into the shape of a heart. And here you can see it more closely and how it's stuck through with pins. This is part of a suite of practices that we see in the 17th century, particularly in the southeast of England. Most of them seem to be of this date, most from the latter half of the 17th century, some going on into the early to mid 18th century. There are earlier examples, but it seems that many of these bottles may have been curated. So even though we find some occasionally in earlier stoneware, it seems likely that most of them now date to the latter half of the 17th century. They often contain bent pins, hair, nail clippings, And hearts, such as the one I just showed you, are only found in just a few examples. And I should also note here that the term witch bottle is an anachronistic term that is not found in contemporary sources. So it's a name that's been given to them latterly. Here's another example. This one was found buried under a fireplace in a house in Earsham in Norfolk. And hearths are another characteristic place where these items are found. But this one's been x-rayed, and you can see iron nails, and there seems to be possibly some copper alloy items in it too. And notice how both this one and the previous one, the contents are concentrated around the neck. That's because many of these devices were buried inverted. So an important part of these vessels is that they're very tightly stoppered as well as inverted. And it's a big part of why they're so well preserved. They have stoppers made of cork, clay, wax, and even lead. What's important clearly is that the contents can't escape. These are vessels that have been hidden away, they've been buried, put out of sight. They're found not only under hearths and thresholds, but they're also retrieved from other boundary sites, stream banks, parish boundaries, and sometimes from the River Thames. Here's another example. This is from Greenwich, actually one of the few examples that isn't found under a boundary. Here you can see the contents again stuck in the neck, but look what else is present. You can see the liquid. And it turns out that urine is a key component of these vessels. In those vessels that have been tested, not many, but it seems to have been present in most cases. And in fact, there are examples of empty vessels that have been found that may well have contained only urine. This example was analyzed by retired chemist Alan Massey, and he found that it was the urine of a smoker. It contained a lot of nicotine. And it was also bottled up together with 12 nails, 8 pins. Note how the pins are deliberately bent. Also with hair that had a bunch of head lice in it, and a piece of leather pierced by a nail. Hair and fingernail clippings are also found in other cases. So these are intriguing objects. Bellarmines or Bartman vessels were produced in the Rhineland from the 15th century. They have a very distinctive broad belly and a narrow neck with this male face, this sort of grimacing male face and medallion also on the belly that's applied in clay before they're fired. By the 18th century, these sorts of vessels fall out of use, and so later witch bottles tend to use glass steeple bottles or other containers. And it was actually one of these steeple bottles that was in the grave that I was looking at when I was a postdoctoral fellow. So these vessels were first studied in any sort of systematic way by Ralph Merrifield. And he looked at them in the context of other protective magical devices. And it was Merrifield that noted that they first appear in Southeast England and remain very common there, although the practice also spreads through the rest of England and also to New England as well. This distribution, of course, also reflects the source of German stoneware, which came in primarily through the port of London and then was traded elsewhere in South England. Potteries in the Rhine area controlled much of the trade in stoneware until the mid to late 17th century, when British potteries started making it. And it's possible that the increased availability of stoneware may have something to do with increased numbers of these vessels at the time. So I want to use these vessels today to think about the constitution of the modern body. The 16th to 17th century has been identified as a period that saw a changing sense of self and of interior subjectivity. And of course, continuing anxiety about bodies and souls at this period. It's a time that is often identified as the origin point for the liberal humanist subject. And it's a moment when an understanding of a hidden, bounded, and more interiorized self is thought to emerge, that is often contrasted with earlier medieval theories of the self. So I'd like to suggest that these objects can offer another strand of vernacular evidence in contrast to textual sources. They show, really, I think they show how these changes were being worked through in practice. So when we look at a pottery vessel, it seems like a very obvious metaphor for the body. And we can see that today, right, just in the terminology we use for the pots that we study, with mouths, lips, necks, shoulders, and even ears, you know. So it seems quite intuitive. And what's interesting is this language of the body as a vessel comes through too in the sort of metaphorical language that we use, particularly around emotions. This language tends to situate the body as something fragile, something breakable, a breakable container for the emotions, and it's a very powerful image, and one that continues to organize modern understandings of self and subjectivity. One thing to notice here is how the language of emotions suggests that they're difficult to contain, and they desire to flow and to move through the body. So just hold on to that. So this is where we are with bodies and vessels today. But what about the 17th century? Was the early modern body like a vessel in the way that we understand it today? David Hillman, in a book called Shakespeare's Entrails, explores how the modern separation of material body and immaterial mind had not yet emerged in the early modern period. Instead, he argues that people were conceptualized in terms of a resolutely materialist physicality. He says that when we look at Shakespeare's language of, for example, of internal organs, we tend to think about it in metaphorical terms. But at the time, he argues that it was understood more literally. So when we think about the interiority of the self, he argues, in the late 16th and early 17th century, this was inseparable from the interiority of the body. So the 17th century is therefore an important time for tracking the transition between this very embodied sense of self and the emergence of a more separated and Cartesian understanding of mind and body. What parts of the body are highlighted in these objects? Well, we've seen the nail clippings, the hair and the urine, and the occasional heart, but the witch bottle itself also draws attention to two other components. The bottle itself emphasizes the head through this grimacing face, and then also the swollen belly that holds the liquid within. Turning to another historical account, Jan Pernis draws our attention to the role of the stomach in the constitution of the person at this time. She notes that before this Cartesian mind-body model became prevalent, the stomach was considered a seat of feeling and thinking. And I'm sure you're all familiar with Elizabeth I's Tilbury speech, in which she rallied the English troops against the invading armada. And she's recorded as saying, "I know how I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." And Pernis observes how this linking of heart and stomach assigned them equal value and points to the importance of the two bodily organs together in how self and identity were understood. And the stomach, she suggests, played a particularly important role in the emotions. And I should just note as an aside that it's perhaps significant that the term pot-bellied seems to date to this period as well. It's first attested in 1657. So this is just another interesting kind of observation to throw in here. Let's think a bit more about the felt hearts, often stuck with pins. So turning to historians of the heart, Heather Webb has explored the changing ways in which the heart was understood in the 17th century. And a key source here, of course, is Harvey's 1628 treatise on the circulation of the blood. Webb shows how Harvey's text drew upon medieval anatomy and medicine to delineate a living, breathing, and porous heart alongside his more physiologically grounded concept that would eventually eclipse these older ideas. One central medieval vision of the heart, as Webb describes it, was as a porous and heavily trafficked space, the center of the body that generated spirits which could reach out into other bodies, creating a much more porous sense of self. So this triad of heart, head, and belly were central to medieval and early modern conceptions of self. Galenic medical traditions divided the body into three regions, each governed by its organ: brain, heart, and liver. So we have a kind of persisting medieval model of the body in this object in the context of changing conceptions of self and embodiment of the 16th to 17th century. Witchcraft, of course, is especially concerned with the ways in which humans can act on others at a distance. And in the case of witch bottles, the body of the witch was understood to penetrate into and circulate through the world through its physical connection with excised parts and secretions. And here I'd like to give you a contemporary description, which is published in Merrifield. It's very well known, by Joseph Laygrave. And he talks about ways to sort of treat, being attacked by a witch. You take the urine of the patient, the person who's been attacked, you close it up in a bottle, put into it 3 pins near nails or needles with a little white salt, keeping the urine always warm. If you let it remain long in the bottle, it will endanger the witch's life. For I have found by experience that they will be grievously tormented, making their water with great difficulty. So the first thing to note here, of course, is the concern with urine and with heat. The stopping of bodily excretions in line with Galenic theories of bodily humors and temperaments is always a bad thing, as the fluids and excretions of the body should flow for the continuance of good health. This, of course, is based in medieval understandings of the humors, in the way in which the body is made up of a balance of the 4 humors associated with corresponding elements of the universe, all associated with these different bodily fluids. And medieval medicine treated illness by assessing and moderating the imbalance of humors. So we have things like bloodletting and, of course, urine scrying, peeing into a pot and looking into the pot and seeing it was a way to diagnose illness. So coming back then to Blagrave's description, how do we make sense of the fact that both witch and victim seem to be represented in the same vessel? Well, he enlightens us. The reason is because there's part of the vital spirit of the witch in it. So such is the subtlety of the devil that he will not suffer the witch to infuse any poisonous matter into the body of man or beast without some of the witch's blood being mingled with it. So here we come back to this heart, which generated the porous heart, which generated these spirits which could penetrate out into the world. So, as Merrifield points out, the witch then has established a magical link of sympathy with the victim. And it's through this that the witch, he or herself, can be attacked, turned back on the witch through the victim's urine and the hair and nails of the victim, which contain a part of the witch that's traveled out from the witch's body. It's a very different understanding of the body and its extensions. It's one that sees the potential for other bodies to penetrate one's own and for parts of others' bodies to be left behind in doing so. And what it suggests is that both the witch bottle represents both the witch and the patient and their entwined biographies. So here we have a vessel with the heart at its center and where the circulation of fluids within and through the body is a key concern. And of course, the use of urine in the vessels speaks directly to this concern with flow and containment. The swollen belly of 16th and 17th century witch bottle is one in which the humors have been stoppered up and stopped from flowing. It's one that chooses the impermeable and tough nature of stoneware over other more fragile vessels, avoiding any possibility that the spirits produced from the heart could penetrate out into the world. Clearly, what we're seeing here are anxieties about bodily boundaries, about the invasion of the body being expressed through these practices. And what I'd suggest is that these anxieties were negotiated not only through these vessels, but through the gathering of boundaries and their holding in place. When we look at the specifics of placement, vessels are buried at these threshold sites, at liminal places, ditches and walls, marking the edge of place, securing it as a contained and bounded entity. They're placed at vulnerable points of transition, particularly chimneys and doorways, acting to regulate and protect passage into and out of place in the same way that bodily excretions are regulated, in this case, stoppered up firmly. So the passage into houses over thresholds held in place by bottles or cooking on hearths under which bottles had been buried protects the household as much as the individual who's been attacked. And if we view these items from the perspective of our now much more individualized model of medicine and of selfhood, we miss how witchcraft was a problem of relationships with the whole family and household. Conflicts over witchcraft took place in the domestic sphere frequently through concerns over childcare, over food and animals. And the witch transgressed the boundaries of the house, entering uninvited into this domestic interior and attacking the bodies within it. So the concern then with bodily boundaries is mediated through this holding of boundaries more generally, simultaneously telling us something about placemaking and placemaking activities through which witches were constituted, and also through which modes of containment were constituted. Through the burying of bottles, both places and bodies are produced as holding in and holding out, beckoning and assembling some elements and pushing others away. These anxieties about boundaries and flows and the sort of flows of excretions and spirits are, of course, gendered. And we know that the vast majority of witches accused and convicted in the trials of the 16th and 17th centuries were women, to the point where some authors portray the witch craze as a gendered persecution of women. Laura Gowing has outlined how women's place in the hierarchies of household and community was often defined through the invasion and defense of bodily boundaries. She gives a couple of examples. Newcastle, 1663, Jane Milburn said that Dorothy Stranger had appeared in the night and tried to pull her out of bed, nip and bite her arms, tormented her body. She couldn't rest all night and was likely to tear her very heart in pieces. And another, Mary Ernley, falling into fits of sickness, crying out that Wilkinson's wife pricked her with pins and ran a spit into her. And yet, in the context of these women, primarily women being accused and often doing the accusing, the vessels are decorated with this masculine bearded face. And what I suggest here is that medieval traditions of medicine are still at play here. In the actions of witch bottles, as we've seen, we can see the concerns with heat and with cold and with flows and excretions. And according to Galenic theories, again, women's bodies were colder and wetter and more malleable than those of men, more fertile and more liable to decay. But the witch's body was understood as hard and intractable, inverting the usual understanding of women's bodies as more open and permeable. And there are cases, lots of examples from trials, for example, where magistrates tried to cut a witch's hair only to find the scissors bending in the hand, or in others, victims and accusers trying to draw the witch's blood to destroy her power, and the needle refusing to penetrate the skin of the witch. So what I suggest is maybe the masculine imagery on the Bellarmine bottles is not simply incidental, but was really selected for actively because it spoke to these common perceptions of witches and their masculine attributes. So to sort of start to wrap things up then, I think witch bottles have a lot to tell us about the changing understandings of the body and self in the 16th and 17th centuries. In particular, I think they point to an emergent concern with the bounded body in popular culture. It's a concern within which the body was not conceptualized as a fragile vessel for the soul as today, but rather one in which body and soul were materially tied together with the heart and stomach at the center. And here I'd like to think for a moment too about the historical trauma of witchcraft, of the executions in England, for example, of hundreds of people, just in England alone, within a period of decades, and of all of the accusations and trials and suspicions of neighbor against neighbor, of the need to defend houses and bodies against these problematically extended people. And perhaps we can think about witchcraft itself as playing an important role in the constitution of the modern body. We see here a new concern with containment being worked through in these devices, yet within an older idiom of flow and interpenetration. Witchcraft, of course, has tended to be seen as a shameful and embarrassing stage in the narrative of Western European society. By the 18th century, it was firmly associated with the lower classes, subject to ridicule. Even the passage of the 1736 Act that abolished the prosecution of witches was said to have been accompanied by laughter in the House of Commons. So there was a distancing that took place, which then was reenacted and reinscribed in 19th and 20th century anthropological accounts, the discourse of the movement from magic to religion to science. But perhaps we might ask whether witchcraft played a more important and constitutive role in the emergence of the modern body. The remembered trauma of these bodily invasions were cured on the small scale in households across England in a set of practices of which witch bottles were just one iteration. But the bodily invasions were treated at a larger scale by, perhaps we can argue, by a shift to a more protected and delimited understanding of the self. So that's it, more or less. And I hope with this presentation that I've shown what Mary always argued for, that careful historicized attention to material culture can reveal a great deal about gender, personhood, and the presentation of self, and also open up new questions for exploration. Happy to take any questions if there are any.
Hi, that was an incredible talk. So fascinating. I had a question about, well, this might be apocryphal. I'm not sure about it. As far as I understood it, Bellarmine jugs were named after Cardinal Bellarmine. And was that true at the time? Were people aware of a link to the church? And how does that interact with the apotropaic character of the vessels?
Yeah, there's actually, Charles also has a really nice piece on this, all about the Bellarmine vessels. So yeah, they are said to be named after him. I think it seems to be more coincidental than anything else. He was around at the period. There's no definite evidence that there was any connection at all. So I'm not sure that that was a meaningful link for people, you know, in England, for example, at the time. Yeah, I think I mean, the face is really interesting, and there is an older tradition, of course, of face jugs and of, you know, sort of grimacing masks on ceramics that this sort of is part of. But it's very interesting that this particular set of practices only appears in England, you know, so that they're being produced in the Rhineland, but we don't, there's not, as far as I know, there's no evidence of anything similar over there.
Thank you, Zoe. That was amazing. Well, I put on my pottery hat to ask. I, of course, love the point about the way that we categorize the parts of the vessel. That's so right, and I never thought about it from this vantage point. So can you talk to me a little bit about the changing or not shape of these bottles over the course of the 17th and 18th century?
One of the problems actually is they don't change a great deal, and so people have tried to date them by the masks and the medallions, and with varying degrees of success. I think people are not super confident in the in the schema that have been developed. So yeah, I think they start being produced at the end of the 15th century. I think, yeah, and then so some of the earlier ones are easier to tell, but from the late 16th century through to the 17th century, it's more difficult to sort of tell, you know, what the date is. As far as I know, I'm not a ceramicist of English pottery, so yeah.
Some of the glass bottles, those were 18th century, and they're very slim. And would you, so you didn't go into this, but would you think about the changing silhouette or profile vis-a-vis these changing conceptions?
I think it's important, actually. I think that by the 18th century, there's no need for the sort of the kind of echo or the iconic sort of figuration of the person in the bottle, because by that point, the notion of body as a container is starting to, I think, you know, become something that's more widely spread. So I think that, yeah, there's no need to sort of make it look like a person, because people already are starting to understand that it can be like a person as a container. Yeah.
Thank you. It was brilliant. I really enjoyed that. And I actually want to sort of follow up a little bit on, or kind of the comment that you made that this specific English or sort of Eastern English practice, but at the same time, when it sort of then transforms the use in those glass bottles, that sort of goes broader. So are you aware of any kind of similar related phenomena sort of elsewhere around that time? Because you did relate it to that 17th century, is sort of that transition from medieval to Cartesian thinking is not a specifically English phenomenon, of course. And also sort of, well, it struck me what I was, I'm reminded of an article that appeared a couple of years ago, which is actually about Hellenistic Punic worlds, of the period where I work. which is similarly sort of how about human figurines that are bottle shaped, and that's really sort of the author. It's a brilliant piece that similarly talks about vessels as the containers of bodily fluids, and there's a whole lot of interesting elements. So are you, so really my question therefore is sort of, whereas this specific phenomenon is English, but there must be a lot of other, how do you say, if not parallels, then sort of overlapping, joining sort of phenomena.
You find examples of these in New England, which is fascinating. Yeah, and they're in textual sources as well from here, but they don't tend to be in Bellarmine bottles, which is interesting. So that's another whole area that I haven't really thought about. But also they can be situated with a whole suite of other practices in England and probably elsewhere in Europe at the time that are medical in nature, that involve heating urine to observing urine and doing other kinds of interventions against witchcraft as well. There's other examples of sticking pins in hearts but not containing them. These are earlier dates, so the 16th century. So you've got examples of hearts being made. You've got examples of urine being heated up with pins in it. These are an earlier date, but there's no containment going on. So it's interesting that the containment and the stoppering seems to be something that's very 17th century. I need to do more reading and writing on this, but yeah, this is where I am with it at the moment. Yeah.
Got it. All right, let's try that again. All right, our next presenter is Anne Stahl. Anne is professor of anthropology and distinguished Lansdowne Fellow at the University of Victoria. Her work has centered community-based historical and archaeological study of how daily life in Banda, Ghana has reshaped West Africa's involvement in global exchange over the last 1,000 years, with the aim to develop material histories that help us to understand how global connections shape the social and political economic worlds of colonizers and colonized alike. She's a past winner of the Society of Africanist Archaeologists Annual Book Prize and the Patty Jo Watson Distinguished Lecturer at the American Anthropological Association Annual Meeting. Welcome, Anne.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for taking time out of your day to join us here. And like everybody else, I want to thank Andrea and Mac and Maria. It's wonderful to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation and the help with the logistics. Before sharing thoughts on my topic today, I want to acknowledge that we're gathered on the territory of the Massachusetts and their neighbors, the Wampanoag and the Nipmuc peoples who've stewarded the land around us for hundreds of generations. Just about 400 years ago, my ancestors were among those who settled in what the Puritans called the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It's important to acknowledge the beginnings and ongoing nature of the harms to sovereignty, territory, and water set in motion by the so-called Great Migration, of which they were a part. Now, territorial acknowledgements, let's see if we can move forward here. We're not moving. Help. SOS. Not sure why this is not progressing. Oh, is that loose? Wait. This isn't working. Oh. There we go. Okay, good. Thank you. Share sound, we're good there, share. Thanks. Okay, thank you. We're cooking. Mary would have liked that. Okay, so territorial acknowledgements are about tense and temporality, about past, present, and future. They are claims about duration, and posters like these produced by the Donlin organization are a material reminder of duration. They invoke tense. You are in the present moment on Indigenous land. They challenge forgettings of the past that erase Indigenous people. In the process, they provoke futures grounded in remembering. Archaeology, too, is about tense and temporality. As archaeologists, we study things in order to expand understandings of the past. We stake our claim on illuminating history across scales, ranging from the daily to the longue durée. Because archaeology's material sources help us to learn things we cannot from written or oral sources, and we've been hearing interesting examples of that this afternoon, we make our case for archaeology's relevance to both historic and so-called prehistoric times. Mary's work was exemplary in demonstrating archaeology's value for illuminating the unwritten lives of women, laborers, and others. Her scholarship was distinguished by careful attention to things, theory that informed rather than obfuscated, and method that created a convincing bridge between the two. She wanted to know about the things through which people stitched their lives together, and she shared what she learned in ways that made a difference in how we think about and approach the world. So Andrea and Mac asked me to focus remarks on time and materiality, no small task in light of recent theoretical interventions inspired by process philosophy and new materialisms. Much has been said in these literatures about time, temporality, succession, and duration, and here I risk toe dipping into the deep waters of theoretical debate that are really outside my wheelhouse. But in keeping with a career in which my scholarship has been more problem and context focused than aligned with a particular theory, I'll reflect on materiality, time, and duration through the lens of the long-running Banda research project, which ran from 1982 to 2014. So there's some duration. And the more recent Banda Heritage Initiative since 2016 I've been involved in, during which I've had the privilege over these 4 decades of working in the rural Banda area of West Central Ghana. So for decades, click. Why is this not working? Okay, let's try. Is there something maybe with that, with the top thing, if we keep, I don't know if it was working fine for everyone. There I am, okay. So, well, we'll see if this works. You could just hang out up here. Okay. So for decades, and that's me in 1982, the problem that occupied my attention is how rural village contexts in Africa, which have long been imagined as somehow outside of history, were in history in ways that mattered to villagers' lives and to the histories of people living elsewhere. This problem arose from a way of thinking about and talking about time and materiality that has proven remarkably durable and continues to animate public thought. one that imagines time through a social evolutionary lens. It's worth pointing out that when people of my generation came into archaeology, Mary was my senior, but not by very much. The past was imagined as a container in need of filling, with its basic scaffolding inherited from the foundational work of prehistorians, like Sir John Lubbock. Schematically, the past occupied the y-axis of now to then. The x-axis represented space. It encompassed an imagined continuum of societies ranging from the so-called civilized to savage in 19th century rubrics like Lubbock's. By the 1970s, denigrating terminology of primitive, savage, and barbarian had been replaced by alternatives like bands, tribes, chieftains, and states, but not by much. There were still textbooks that had some of that vocabulary when I was an undergraduate. Despite reluxification, the scheme carried forward the implication that others lived in a different time than us, in what Johannes Fabian termed typological time. Now, the logic of bins to which societies past and present could be assigned has proven remarkably durable. Some version of this social evolutionary scenario is alive and well in Western common sense and introductory archaeology textbooks alike. This is why in a forthcoming book in Polity Press's Why It Matters series, I felt compelled to devote a chapter in a very short book to time, knowing, and the use of analogy to draw general readers' attention to the common sense, in quotation marks, that continues to inscribe these premises. So turning to West Africa, this set of time tools melded with the ethnographic present to suspend African village life as if in amber. In this imagining, village life was mere duration, the long durée of the Iron Age before the onset of modernity through contact, prehistory before history. Looking back, this was the common sense packed into the baggage that I carried with me when in 1982 I first traveled to Banda, Ghana, where I've worked ever since. As a doctoral student, I was interested in one of the revolutionary, so-called revolutionary changes that marked progress in human history, the advent of agriculture. I dutifully recorded the so-called Iron Age sites that we found, well, mostly were shown by people who knew they were there all the time. So we recorded the Iron Age sites during survey. However, I was not particularly interested in these as my focus was on earlier sites. Nevertheless, some of these sites were temporally jarring. Their materiality pushed back against the Iron Age bin into which I placed them. Located adjacent to contemporary villages like this one, the village of Makala, one of these sites lies at the end of this street. Pottery on these sites looks similar to pots made in the area at the time and still today. Elders spoke of the British colonial officer known as the Breaker of Walls, who implemented British village planning and sanitation schemes with new villages aligned on a grid pattern, which is what you're looking at here. This oral history opened my eyes to the fact that Banda's seemingly traditional villages were established in the 1920s. Suddenly, the Iron Age looked like history, and what had seemed like duration began to look like change and dynamism. Eric Wolf's seminal Europe and the Peoples Without History was published during the year of my dissertation fieldwork. For all its flawed details, Wolf's book provided a frame for thinking differently about time and material processes. And so thinking in terms of these categories, the idea that there were cross-cutting relationships between people who were so-called in and outside of history. Those sites, situated next door to late 20th century villages, thus bent the arc of my career toward investigating dynamism over duration. On the face of it, exploring duration and dynamism is a question of material evidence. Of course, we're all well aware today that continuity always threads through change, just as continuity involves dynamism. It's worked at through practice. No present moment is simply a reprint of the past. But like a water-witching stick, archaeologists' arcs bend toward duration or dynamism in relation to the places and contexts of our work. In recent decades, archaeologists working in settler colonies have foregrounded duration as an antidote to indigenous erasure, using archaeology to remind settlers that indigenous peoples never went away and are here today. This often involves a strategy of showing how enduring forms carry forward in novel materials. So Matt Liebman's work on the Mickey Mouse Kachinas comes to mind here. In other colonial contexts like West Africa, late 20th century archaeologists felt a different imperative: to use archaeological materials to remind the world that Africa is coeval with elsewhere and its peoples have a dynamic history. Here, a common theme has been how people took up new goods for their own purposes. Both arguments are about time and duration. Both are also cases of what Michel Rolfe-Trouillot in 2003 described as counterpunctual arguments based in evidence and ethics and directed primarily at Western interlocutors. They're arguments that challenge what he called the savage slot by first laying out what is assumed commonsensical or universal, second, countering it with empirical evidence, and third, taking a lesson for the future. The Banda Research Project took the form of a counterpunctual aimed to get people thinking differently about Africa's role in intercontinental connections, which can be summarized as you think of Africa as a pliable source of raw materials and Africans as indiscriminate consumers of products manufactured elsewhere. But I will show you how materials and goods circulated across continents, co-producing lifeways across regions, so that you understand the role of Africans in shaping these broader systems. This inclination toward duration or dynamism provides a springboard to consider tensions in what Oliver Harris recently summarized as two competing models of time: archaeology as history and archaeology as memory, on his way to advocating for a third model that synthesizes chronology and co-presence in relation to process archaeology. Archaeology as history is the familiar project of linear sequence and accurate chronologies. We're all familiar with it. It encourages what Rachel Carolyn recently called a block model, with blocks of duration marked by spurts of dynamism. Conventional blocks define us professionally as Stone Age, Iron Age, or historical archaeologists. And they often train narrative focus on origins and sequence, with duration treated as time between when interesting things happen, change. Through this frame, archaeological materials are valued for their pastness. Things allow us to access, quote unquote, the past through their material endurance. Our job as archaeologists is to tease out what things in their contexts tell us about the past, the alchemy involved in moving from what Trouillot called historicity 1, what happened, to historicity 2, what is said to have happened. On the other hand, archaeology as memory rejects linear time and emphasizes the multi-temporality of the present. This frame emphasizes how the present is comprised of intersecting temporalities of materials, things, and beings, including people. The past is contemporary with the present, so if we think about things like Landes capital, mounds, things recovered from the ground, all are present. Archaeology as memory informs perspectives like contemporary archaeology and symmetrical archaeology. And through this frame, in the words of Laurent Olivier, the world is living memory. We find ourselves immersed in temporality, which blurs the boundaries between past, present, and future. Temporality involves breaking down the barriers between time periods that come together in one moment of the materiality of the world. Now, owing to decades of debate at this point about the archaeological record, we appreciate today that archaeological materials are in and of the present. They're available to us to study because they have endured, nor is the past a stable location that we access by studying things. Rather, our accounts of the past emerge iteratively from studying things and contexts in the present. In short, we make and highlight temporalities through our practices of engaging with archaeological materials and contexts in relation to problems and questions like, what does duration look like and why is it important? So both frames have informed our work in Banda, and I'll swiftly illustrate before turning to how Banda archaeology and our project's photo archives. So we've been working in the area for 40 years. We have archives that we've been working to repatriate to community. So to tell you a little bit about how those have become agents of duration through the Banda Heritage Initiative. Now, much of our work in Banda aligns with Harris's model of archaeology as history, that we can summarize something like this. In the beginning, there were archaeological materials differentially distributed and clustered across the Banda area. All were of the present, but with promise to illuminate the past, and verily, with attention to style and stratigraphic context. The pottery could be assigned to phases, and the phases could be dated by association with radiocarbon dated materials. When time entered the valley where radiocarbon could not lead us from chronological darkness, imports or imported forms aided our quest, and with time, there were taxonomic entities of duration punctuated by change and dynamism, and lo, there was chronology. This linear time scaffolding was critical to relating what was happening in Banda to what was happening in the wider world during the colonial period, the Atlantic trade, and before that, the Saharan trade. It was critical to making the case that Banda was in history rather than prehistory, and that villagers were coeval in dynamically responding to the changing world in which they were part and to which they contributed. While in the throes of creating a block time scaffolding, we were acutely aware that sequence is anything but a set of neat boxes. We made thousands of decisions about how to classify individual sherds, whether to lump and split, but ambiguities and overlaps are papered over when we draw neat lines of block time. So certainly at our sites, we have multiple phases, but in terms of the way in which we talk about the sites, we allied this messiness, to come back to the earlier point, we allied this messiness through narrative. The blocks provide an understandable, if blunt, scaffolding for talking about change and continuity. We create succession along lines of demarcation and difference, fostering plateau-like impressions of durations punctuated by periods of innovation, replacement, and change. So archaeology as history privileges change rather than duration, and it colludes with our two-dimensional representational arsenal, which is better equipped to deal with linear successive time than it is durational multi-temporality. So like others, I have sought to complicate this archaeology as history mode of narrative through an archaeology as memory frame, doing this by following things, forms, and materials to gain insight into durable yet malleable practices that don't align with phase boundaries. For example, we can trace how people in the area materially engaged serpentine forms through things made of metal and clay in times when Banda was enmeshed in Saharan trade, laying foundation for new forms and assemblages as Atlantic trade was on the rise. An archaeology as history frame scaffolded this inquiry as I worked iteratively between later and earlier contexts. Working back in time from a Couleau phase shrine, we can discern material histories of things and elements assembled there as Atlantic trade gained in prominence. The shrine's composition included the bones of 2 pythons, iron rings and bangles, some serpentine in form, together with blue beads and a gun flint. In earlier Injere phase, which is late Saharan trade context, similar serpentine bangles were part of shrine assemblages, though without python bones and with exotic stone beads rather than imported glass ones. Shrines, variously emplaced through layers of a metallurgical workshop that built up through decades of use and reuse, potentially centuries, reference through their things and locations shrine assemblages and actions that preceded them. I've argued that here traces seen and unseen endured through human, non-human thing relations as the mound built up, helping us to glimpse how sinews of memory threaded through actions across time. These assemblages and temporal resonances are more in line with new or different ontologies than those that have guided archaeological thinking in the past, even if their contours remain elusive. So Banda has experienced considerable change in the 4 decades during which I and my students have been coming and going. This is the main street of the main village, Banda Henkro, in 1982. You're standing in the same place. This is what it looked like in 2016. So you can see electrification, mobile phones, transportation infrastructure, and much of this change has resulted from the construction of a hydroelectric dam. Here you see the dam site in 1990, and this dam was planned in the colonial period. Construction first started under Nkrumah, the first independent head of state of Ghana, but was not built until 2008 to 13 in a partnership with Sino-Hydro. So the Chinese are, as you know, I'm sure, building dams all over Africa. The construction of this dam has been accompanied by a social evolutionary rhetoric underpinned by progressive developmentalism. And here you see a billboard as they appeared around as kind of sails around this hydroelectric dam, picturing, and you've seen a picture of the existing villages, picturing a Bui city that was supposed to be built to accompany the dam. So this kind of imagining of a progressive developmental future for places like the Banda area. So rural areas, and this is ongoing in Ghana, are cast as places where people's eyes are closed. This is a phrase glossed as primitive in English. A powerful implication is that solutions to today's problems necessarily come from elsewhere. And in the years since the dam's construction, our project has pivoted from one focusing on doing archaeology to one making heritage through the Banda Heritage Initiative. Funded by the Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, we've developed a web exhibit and supporting digital repository of heritage resources that include photos, texts, videos of elders reflecting on change in their lifetimes. We've been using the photos of landscape change as affordances to prompt conversations and performances as well. So these kinds of resources are included in the digital repository that then supports a web exhibit. Framed in Trouillot's terms, we've pivoted from learning about historicity 1, what happened, to putting historicity 2, what is said to have happened, to work in a counterpunctual narrative that emerged from community consultation and is directed not to necessarily Western interlocutors, but to local and national ones. So we're in the process of developing school curriculum based in this narrative. And stated simply, it goes like this. You think our ancestors had their eyes closed. Using evidence, we will show you how our ancestors dynamically improvised and innovated in relation to changing circumstances so that youth and generations to come recognize possibilities and value in learning from the past. This narrative emerged through conversations with elders, middle school teachers, and student focus groups in Banda. The resulting web exhibit and curriculum framing centers on the theme that our grandmothers and grandfathers were knowledgeable people. Their eyes were open. Did you know? And following that with resources that draw on archaeology and elders' knowledge to support social studies and science classroom learning. So did you know that our ancestors made their own cloth, their own metals? Did you know that they made pottery? Here you see Mary Yukosawa holding the picture to the right, which is a picture of her mother. So there's some really interesting intergenerational kinds of reflections taking place through these photographs that are serving as affordances for conversations. We held a band heritage celebration in 2019 following on these consultations, attended by local dignitaries, chiefs, and elders, and more than 600 community members from many villages attended. And Mary, the guy was calling it like a, like a cooking show. And, Mary Acosta was on the rim and she's, ahead of so-and-so. And so we return to tense, to the question of tense, past, present, and future. As archaeologists, we make time in various ways, as history and as memory. This is not an idle pastime. Working together with community, history and memory hold potential to challenge the ongoing erasure of local practice and knowledge by the cowcatcher of progressive developmentalism, today dressed up in neoliberal attire. In the process, our ways of making time through archaeology's material affordances provokes futures grounded in remembering. And this is what we are working to do, again, with the curriculum, to help young people appreciate the science-based knowledge, the knowledge that animates social studies, that comes from their own past, from their own place. Thank you very much. And a shout out to the guys in the back. Thank you for making this keep moving. Yeah. So any questions or? Yeah, so.
Thanks, Anne. That was wonderful. So I have lots of questions, but I'll just ask this one, which is what kind of response did you get from the children in schools, from working in schools, to this approach? How have they responded?
So we're still in the kind of the middle of the process. So what you saw there were junior high school age youth who were working with the photos. We were doing fairly simple kinds of exercises, taking pictures of different points in the potting sequence, in the operational sequence, and getting them to put them in order, and just talking about wire pots, different colors. And we had a wonderful experience when we were in one of the potting villages. Junior high school age kids just happened to be walking by as we were talking with Mary Yokosawa. She had a number of pots out in the courtyard, and we had this fascinating kind of impromptu conversation that involved her as well as some of the archaeologists who were around, talking about, again, why different shapes of pots, why different colors of pots. The young people put together the notion that pots that are not coated are best for water cooling, and they talked about why that is. And when we finished this conversation, we said, you've just worked through science. You've just done some, chemistry, some physics, and what was wonderful about that conversation, and again, prompted Mary Yokosawa to get her Potter group coming to the Heritage Festival, was that they're interested in coming into the local classrooms to talk to students. So we haven't yet taken, I'm working with a PhD student in Canada, an education PhD student who is developing this curriculum. And we are headed back, I hope, this summer to get people's feedback, try it out with some focus groups, and refine it in light of that. Yeah, thanks.
I have a linguistic question.
Okay.
And the linguistic question really is about, so you were so eloquent about the tenses, the time stamping of language in English.
Yeah.
And my question is, if you could reflect a little on the time stamping of the native language. I don't know what it is, but
yeah. So it is a language that it's related to Sinufo languages. It's a minority language in Ghana. And so one of the interesting and historically fascinating aspects of the Banda area is that it's what Igor Kopytov called an internal African frontier. Very small area in terms of the Banda chieftaincy is comprised of 25 villages. There are 5 distinct languages spoken within those, so ethnic linguistic groups within those 25 villages. So in the Fanra, there's tense. Tense is expressed in different ways than in English, but that varies across the Akan languages, Nafanra, and so on. So I'm not a linguist. I'm not well equipped to answer the question, but it's an important one in terms of, and that's one of the things we'll want to sort of explore through this curriculum, is thinking about, are we, and we've had these conversations in terms of, it's important for this curriculum to be in English. Because English is the official language of Ghana, and the children need to sort of have some facility with it. But we are also in conversation about translating it into, and then the question becomes which of the local languages. So yeah, the language issue is important. Yeah. And sorry for that squeal. Okay, thank you very much.
You prefer this one? Excellent. All right, our final presenter is Dan Hicks. Dan is professor of contemporary archaeology at Oxford University in the School of Archaeology, curator of world archaeology at the Pitt Rivers Museum, and a fellow of St. Cross College. Dan works on the material and visual culture of the human past, up to and including the modern, colonial, contemporary, and digital world, and on the history of archaeology, anthropology, art, and architecture. Dan has published 8 books, 2 of which he edited with Mary: the Oxford Handbook of Material Culture Studies and the Cambridge Companion to Historical Archaeology. Dan was awarded the Royal Anthropological Institute's Rivers Memorial Medal in 2017. Join me in welcoming Dan.
Okay, thanks so much for that. And I don't have a PowerPoint, I just have Mary looking at you for the period of time that I'm going to talk. And so you have something to look at, but also something that's going to look back at you, or someone that's going to look back at you. And I think in some ways that goes to the heart of what I want to say in the time available to me. So we've heard in these really rich talks so far about the ephemeral, about duration, about the apotropaic, the way in which we might seek to dispel bad luck in the future. So I want to talk about inheritance, which hopefully is going to link into those themes. And I want to really ask, how is it that we can inherit well in a context such as this immense loss for all of us, so early and so soon in her life, and under such awful conditions when all of us were not able to see each other or her. And in doing so, I want to start really with thinking about Mary in terms of the 4 fields, which was so, and she was a 4-field anthropologist, but especially that sense that her relationship with the 4 fields was maybe, for me at least, as someone who worked with her largely as an editor, as a co-editor. We worked with words, we worked with the words of others, we rewrote the words of others. There's some of the people who have been edited, who were on the sharp end of the process of being edited by us in those books. Her relationship in the four fields was largely, I'd say, with the linguistic. So let's think about Mary as a linguistic archaeologist. Let's think about her doctorate. Let's think, I'm afraid here, not about BU, but about another university just a short amount of time north of here. And it's wonderful to have actually the head of archaeology at that institution at which Mary, of course, did her doctorate up in Rhode Island at Brown. So her doctorate, which of course was called "Or What Else You May Please to Call It," and was sort of titled in terms of the subtitle, Folk Semantic Domains, that she was looking at in the lists made of objects in the context of somebody dying, right? In terms of the probate inventories. So the first 6 pages of her doctorate were all simply fiction. She started in that Dietzian way in the 1980 sort of thesis with these tableaux, these interpretive, imaginative tableaux. I think that's incredibly important to remember, that sense that she was at that point trying to address what maybe remains a problem for us, but was certainly, at the time, it was a live issue. How to square structuralism with semiotics, how to make sense of the Geertzian interpretive thick description for archaeology, how to operationalize that incredible line that's there that Dietz has in his book In Small Things, where he talked about what counts as an object and how material culture is something that can operate at the scale of landscape, at the scale of a building, at the scale of an object we can hold in our hands, at the scale of the air that we sculpt with the tongue and the throat and throw out into the world as words. All of that counted for Dietz as things, as the subject area for linguistic archaeology, if we can call it that. So those speech acts and the performative nature of them, I feel, is part of how we think about what we inherit from Mary, how we inherit well from Mary, how we don't allow Mary and other women in our field to be erased from intellectual history of our discipline. How we think about memory, how we remember Mary as she passes, and her memories of Dietz and all those conversations with Henry Glassy and so on, they pass into post-memory. They pass into the sort of memory that exists when the person that did the remembering is no longer here. And there is that sense that I think Mary would really have appreciated, that, you know, after we lose somebody, we start slightly not to recognize how we think of them now in the present, how we remember them, but maybe that's a crucial time in which we shape that memory in the same way as we shape words as they come out of our mouths. So the way in which she wrote about language was subversive. She talked about the subversive poetics of housework. And I think that sense of the everyday nature of fact and fiction, of how to tell stories, of those long emails that we got, that some of us got maybe from Mary, right? Which were forms of an ordinariness, there was a administrative, bureaucratic, occasionally sort of tedious nature to a micro detail to them, but something that linked her writing practice to something that she understood in terms of how people make the worlds they live in. That idea that there was the sense in which, I guess what I'm trying to capture is that there was a playfulness at the same moment as an utter seriousness to everything that she wrote and how she thought about language. So that linguistic archaeology with a bit of Delheim's and a bit of Jim Dietz and a bit of Levi-Strauss and a bit of Geertz, that Geertzian idea of a division between sort of patterns of culture and forces of history was one she just refused, right? I mean, her writing sought to mix those things up. Simply to go back again to the opening sort of chapter of her thesis, she tells us that artifacts communicate. What were they trying to say? So this is 1980, right? These are they're ideas that we would frame differently today, but I think they remain important for us. They remain important when we think about Saidiya Hartman's account of critical fabulation. That sounds in some ways like it has some things in common with what we learn from Mary. And if we go to Hartman writing about how to write history, we learn that fiction can be one way to fill in the gaps of what we don't know. Rather than just allowing erasures of those people who were written out of history, who were not rich enough or had access to the material world enough in order to leave a trace, or even if they left traces, they didn't leave words, we can fill those gaps with our imaginations. And I think that very contemporary, argument that's emerging now and is really inspiring so much important work in African American studies, has so much in common with what Mary was seeking to argue at the time. So a key part of why language was important, imagination was important, fiction as well as fact was important, was Mary's stubborn disdain for the normative, for the processual, but not just in her account, her rejection of the model of the family, of the household, of the boarding household, of course, as she, along with her colleagues, identified at Lowell in Massachusetts, but also the fact she had no time at all for those whose approach to subalternism was simply a sort of boys' club of Marxists of a certain kind, who weren't really operationalizing their Marxism, who refused to allow action to be anything other than resistance to domination. These were incredibly important arguments for her in the early 90s. And it's a skepticism. It's an intolerance for abstract theory that she later, of course, happily shared with anyone that would like to hear about the Luttorian or the symmetrical sort of boys who were doing a similar thing, the Luttorian moment there. And I'm reminded of that impatience in terms of a certain event at the second of the chat meetings that we had in Leicester, where and I mean, how to chair the questions in one, and maybe you can remember, Zoe. There was one, I mean, we've all heard that moment when someone had more of a question than a comment. This was someone well-renowned at every tag meeting, at every chat meeting, for doing the comment at length. And it was always awful when this person stood up and began talking and no one knew how to handle it. Mary, after one of these 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, however, like it was an eternal, because it was incoherent, you know, she said, I have no idea what that meant, and I am not going to allow the panel to answer. Next question, you know, just completely. It didn't make any sense. So but this is language again. This is an interest in theory that's doing something. It's an interest in language. It's an interest in things being well written, well spoken. The sort of, I think someone said earlier, the sense of the precision of theory that is going to help us to understand the past. So Mary's understanding of language, of sort of language in archaeology, starts with the probate inventory. It starts with the folk taxonomy that you could build from these lists. It's related in part. There is a Mary Douglas side to Mary Beaudry. There's a sense of an interest in the importance of housework, the domestic space, the ordinariness, the sort of Bourdieu sense of the practice in the domestic space. But like I say, it's more subversive than either of those two, and more poetic. Because the poetic subversions that she's interested in are able to take us from needlework and sewing to the Atlantic world in a moment. They can start with the milking of a cow, with giving birth, with mothering, with household rituals. And then they can take us into new forms of the self, of the production of self. Her writing was never a monologue. She worked with other people, and that collaborative sense is why her legacy is so complicated, right? Because she had so many relationships with so many different people, which were so complex and so different from each other. But it wasn't a monologue, it was a chorus when you read Mary. And that again, I think, is a central part of her approach to language in archaeology. So the main points I want to make then in terms of Mary's use of language goes back again to her doctoral thesis. Because there's a humanism to Mary, as we've heard, and to Mary's thinking and Mary's intellectual legacy. But it's a very certain kind of humanism that starts with those inventories, the lists of the cup and the dish and the bowl and the basin and the pan and the plate and the pot and so forth. She was using the linguistic anthropology and theory of the 60s and 70s to talk about how those lists aren't simply, as maybe we might say superficially at the moment, are ways into seeing how people ordered their lives, what was it, the basic facts of what was in a household. She talked about modifiers and also post-modifiers. She's very interested in the modifier, in other words, the use of adjectives. This is an old pot. The pot is red. It is a broken pot. These ideas that modifiers relate to relative age, to the condition of that thing. These things, and that relates in some ways to the forms of sort of personhood which are being put out. But crucially, not only the modifier or the post-modifier, the pot which is on the shelf, the pot which is used to feed the cat, but the unmarked is central to what she writes about in her thesis, but also later on. And she's using Joseph Greenberg in part here, but she's kind of really freewheeling in terms of how you think about words. The unmarked is just the cup, right? The unmarked object, the unmarked way of describing. So that sense that we can see objects, order our worlds with things for which we are not defining age and function and size and condition is one way in which Mary's thinking links intimacy and distance. It links us into ambiguity, which is such a central part of what we learn from Mary. Is not, ambiguity just that things can be interpreted in lots of different ways, but what's left unsaid. So at this time at which we're thinking about what we learn from a colleague who's lost, we think about how to inherit. We think about the knowledge we make from lists that are drawn up in terms of what remains, which, as we learn, we need to treat ideas the same as objects. That's one fundamental thing that we learn from Mary. Well, if we see the text in, the text and the artifact as kind of merging into each other, how then are we going to think about a life and a life that was about writing, it was about words. It was about how people use words and perform words in the world, and how we can hold that in our head while thinking about how we make knowledge as archaeologists. So this is, I guess, the final thing I want to say, that in that context, there's a sense in which what we've done this afternoon has rightfully been a post-modifier, right? We have described some of the strands that some of which we could sew together, some of which would be subject to the sort of needlework that was such an important metaphor for what Mary, how Mary thought. But of course, fundamentally, so many of what remains, we need to leave unmarked. Thanks very much. I think we're moving on to the Q&A, but I can take questions. I'm just running away, from Mary. But yeah, I can take questions if you want. Yeah. It's up to you, or should we just go to the Q&A?
I'm not mic'd. Is that all right? Talk into this. Awesome. Hi, everybody. I'm Andrea Berlin in the program of religion and the program in archaeology in the Department of Religion. And I join with Mac in welcoming you here and opening up the Q&A and panel discussion. But before we turn back to our speakers, just a few words of my own. Summoning immateriality. Doesn't that sound like a magic trick? Here this afternoon, Carolyn, Zoe, Anne, and Dan have done just that. And in the process, they have summoned Mary's spirit, her curiosity, her critical acumen, her dedication to the process of inquiry, and of course, her belief that knowledge may be the greatest sphere of immateriality is made via material things. Mary was at the foreground of asking how things make people, how they bring our very selves into being, along with the milieus, as well as the familial and social relationships that those selves inhabit. More than that, she was at the foreground of moving past the connective tissue of those relationships to their emotional resonances. In her work, she illuminated the materiality of social striving via tableware, of economic reversal via reduced outlays for tea time, of pride via a silver thimble belonging to a young woman of lesser station, of the intentionality of leave-taking via trash middens, of loss and its surrounding sentiment via what she termed the emotional taphonomy of discard. This from her excavations of the fire-ravaged remains of an 18th century planter's house at Piper's Little Bay Plantation on the island of Montserrat. The use of material remains to illuminate what Mary called intentions, aspirations, and ambitions was one of her regular magic tricks. My favorite example comes from Privy to the Feast, 80 to Supper Tonight, about two dense deposits of fairly well-to-do household goods from the Spencer Pierce Little Farm in Newberry. It was great to see that picture. Mary put the finds in dialogue, as Dan has eloquently shown us, with many written records, personal diaries, property records, commercial accounts, and recreated life lived in the shade of debt, overextended credit, failed attempts to negotiate prestige, and ambitions unfulfilled. It sounds like a novel. Scholarly sleight of hand on the page. It was an archaeological article. For Mary, objects extended people's own first-person force fields. She believed that archaeology imposed on us an obligation to serve the people whose goods we recover by attending to those force fields. She taught her students, she inspired her colleagues by her own repeated magical ability to spin scholarly gold from material straw. Today, Carolyn, Zoe, Anne, and Dan have repeated the trick, and in so doing, summoned Mary's spirit into our midst. To them and to you, I say thank you. We have the privilege of further interrogating our speakers, and I'm sure there are some queries, but I would like to open with a question for the four of you. These papers were so rich and powerful in breaking down categories and the barriers that we and our field construct, those silos, those cylinders of meaning, the types, the periods, the sites, as if they are unchanging and points in a moment. And so my question is, you have all made the case in a way that we should build a better scaffold. And my question is, how? What should we do?
I think this is a question for the audience.
Start.
So I can start maybe. So I was at Harvard yesterday. to give a talk, and it's very hard to be in this city without thinking about the letter of support for Commonwealth. And I think the Commonwealth letter, I mean, what would Mary have made of the Commonwealth letter moment? One thing that has to be part of the legacy of Mary and her generation of women who fought their way into this discipline has to be to take Me Too seriously, and has to recognize that at Harvard, but also at other universities, anthropology is failing to act upon NAGPRA in any reasonable way at scale in terms of human remains. It's failing to return stolen art to the continent of Africa. You've got the Tamara Lanier versus Harvard case, where a photograph of an enslaved woman will not, well, may or may not be returned to the descendant. And then you've got Me Too. And maybe this is something about anthropology. Maybe this is something about power and bodies and the patriarchy and forms of supremacy. So I think Mary, if she were here to talk about the Commonwealth letter, well, we need to think about that and maybe do that work that she would have been doing.
I can also jump on that. Is this working? I don't know. It's okay. Okay, great. So, I mean, I think also, you know, one of the issues with where we've ended up in anthropology is from a lack of attentiveness to the local context within which we're working and with which we're working, and an over-reliance on the sort of processual model of archaeology in the last century, right? So there was a sense that you were going in to look for the things that you already suspected existed, and there's the whole funding structure resolves around that too. When you write for NSF or whatever, you know, you have to predict you have to make your predictions based on this theoretical framework that we're imposing. And as you know, I think the work we've seen today, all of the work, in fact, as people have increasingly sort of interacted more and worked more closely with communities, I think we're developing much more interesting archaeologies. You know, because just as Anne's work is growing out of the conversations with people locally and the needs and demands and experiences and aspirations of people locally, you get a much richer kind of archaeology there. And that's not to say that it's any less anthropological because it's not using these sort of generalizing processual sort of models of anthropology. It's an anthropology that's really attuned to specific particular historical conditions. And, you know, I see the same thing with Carolyn's work, and I hope we can also see it even with my work on, you know, looking at these English witch bottles. It's so much richer when you work from the context and with, you know, the histories, and whether it's oral histories or other material histories or textual sources, and bring all of that together. And again, I think that's something that Mary really exemplified.
I jump in and kind of springboard from that in terms of thinking about it. And I came to mind as Dan was speaking, this idea of wording, the kind of word work that we do and the kind of writing that we do. One of the things that's become very clear through this recent partnership that I've been involved in, working with educators, is that we are doing a very poor job. We claim that what we do is fascinating and compelling and should be something that, you know, everybody wants to learn about, but we don't do a very good job of sharing that. There certainly are colleagues who are exceptions to that, but many of us, and I include myself in the many, don't do a very good job of really making a compelling case. And so one of the very rich things that's come out of this recent work is interacting with educators, learning about what they would like to know, need to know in order to build curriculum. And I think one of the things that many of you out there have very fresh faces. And I think one of the things that people of our generation haven't done as well as we might do is encouraging you to communicate in different ways, to do different kinds of writing, but also to value that, to think of that as a component of a dissertation, to push for different sorts of standards when it comes, or valuation scales when it comes to things like hiring, tenure, promotion, to place value on those forms of different forms of communicating. This is something I've really learned through being on the Northwest Coast, and in a department that values visual anthropology, so that we are seeing people generating different kinds of academic outputs, if you will, and engaging communities in different ways. So I think that's one of the things we need to do differently, and I think Mary would be on board with that.
Yeah, connecting to the things that you've all said, I think that one thing that was I think it took a while for me to really realize this, but part of Mary's brilliance was picking from many things, having her hands on many things, but also she had a real creative side in her interpretation of everything. I remember just being so struck by this field report that she wrote. I was working with her one summer at Spencer Pierce Little, and we were excavating what seemed to be nothing. It was a French drain, which means it was a bunch of rocks and nothing else. But the way that she described it in the report, through this analogy, for this way that the people were moving the dirt and the transformation of this land for drainage, was amazing to me. And speaking of this was the archaeology of nothing, of a space. And she just had this way of turning a phrase and of kind of pulling things together with a writer's and a reader's voice that I think is a rare moment in archaeology. A lot of us who do archaeology we're really good at organizing things. We're really good at creating tables, but the kind of emotional, descriptive side is something that she really was able to do. And I think it does that thing of she made boring things interesting, and was just singular, I think, in her ability to do that.
Everybody, thank you all so much for these amazing presentations in honor of Mary. I'm wondering, so some of you touched a little bit on the digital, which, as Andrea knows, where I live, and thinking about the different ways in which that interacts with this idea of immateriality and materiality, right? Sure, you can print out a website, but is there a digital footprint of the work that you do? And I'm just wondering, each of you seem to have a different perspective on that. You want to elaborate a little bit on how that relates back to this idea of things we can preserve, things we can hold, things we can study, and if we should.
I'll start, just because now we can go in reverse order. I am reminded of many issues that Mary ran into with technology, but she was also a big proponent of new technology. So she was always kind of bragging about some recent workshops she went to on the BU campus to learn about X, Y, or Z. And at the same time, whatever didn't suit her purposes, she was quite dismissive of, and liked to, maybe blame other people for losing large chunks of data or something like that.
Remember, she's looking over your shoulder.
Well, I would tell her that. But I think that the digital world and the way that we use the digital world is an archaeology of the ephemeral. And of course, we're faced with this, those of us who work in museum fields as well are faced with the tension between the analog and the digital constantly. I don't really have a great answer for this because I am constantly telling my students, yes, you do have to print that out. Yes, you do have to put a paper in the file. We can't just do everything digitally, because I've seen so many waves of digital technology become obsolete. In fact, my own dissertation I can't access anymore in it's Microsoft Word form. So I think that these are wonderful questions, and I am really curious to see what people do with it. So maybe you have some great plans.
So I'll just make an observation that our project involves in part, or was initially conceived in part as sort of digital repatriation, right? So we've always taken physical copies of photos back to community, and the photos that we're working with are largely what I think of as our informal project archives. So when we've been coming and going in the community, taking pictures of landscape, taking pictures of performances of people and so on, and coming to the realization that we had this remarkable archive, but also people's family photo albums in some sense. And so we've had some remarkably poignant moments as we've sat down with photos, and folks have identified mothers and fathers and grandparents and so on. And Banda, from what you saw of the pictures, is not necessarily the obvious place to start with a digital repatriation process, given that electricity only came into the area 12, 15 years ago. And people have mobile phones and they access the digital repository through that. But there's a kind of an analogy with a cultural center that we put up back in the mid-1990s, long before electricity came to the area. And people in the area said to me, my local name is Makwa. Makwa, you must wire your house. And I said, I've been hearing for 20 years that electricity is coming. They said, no, Makwa, you must wire your house because electricity is coming. Well, we didn't have the budget to wire the house. And so we didn't wire the house. And when we'd been away for some time, came back, and sure enough, the community had purchased the poles, put up the poles so that electricity could come before the hydroelectric dam. And there were all the wires tacked up on the outside of the house. And so what I really think of this digital repository that we're building, in part, is wiring the house, because that access is coming. And people are very kind of captivated by digital imagery and the use of photos. And I could talk more about that. But again, that idea of the digital as really one portal, if you will, one affordance that enables people to engage with these resources in ways that are not possible if they're not available in digital form.
I don't think I've got a great deal to offer on the digital. I mean, I've been sort of exploring with my students more recently the analog, actually. So I'm teaching a class at the moment on archaeological illustration and traditions of illustration. And it's a studio class for both artists and archaeologists. And we've been going back to, drawing film and using ink and just sort of playing with these old technologies that most archaeological illustrators don't use anymore. Most people, including myself, do things in Photoshop. But there's something interesting, I think, in this world where all of our students are just swimming in the digital all the time, and we spend so much time on screens, actually coming into the classroom and slowing down and working with papers and getting a sense of the affordances of different kinds of materials. And I guess it's very archaeological too, right, to be working with stuff. So I feel like my head at the moment is in an analog space, and maybe that's a response to being on Zoom for the last couple of years. So yeah.
So I could just add maybe that I think for Mary, so one thing I learned from Mary that I think all of us should hold on to is that everything she did was community building. That's what her research was, right? She was building, she wasn't just working with communities, she wasn't just sharing information, she was building academic communities, building all sorts of very complex infrastructures of people, and that's how she used the digital. At the time that I was working with her, these were just mail lists. These were email. Email was incredibly important, and email lists, in order to get things like sort of chat going and to maintain them and so on. But I think there are things that can happen also over social media. I have to say as well, her favorite form of community creation, while nobody loved being in a dark room on a warm afternoon more than Mary, and I have to say that. Equally, no one loved more than Mary that moment at which someone says, that's it for the afternoon. What we can do now is we can go outside into the sun, we can trip outside, into and have a drink, have a conversation, and have a very analog sort of conversation.
Can you hear? I think it's also important to remember Mary always taught us the lesson to back up our digital files. Not intentionally. Can you hear me all right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So you've been talking, and thank you for these wonderful presentations. It's still really hard to think about this. What I'm thinking about, though, is the importance of the present in each of your presentations. And I'm struck, Carolyn, sorry, that by your reference to ephemerality. And I wonder if you know the work of Jason Dewey on looking at the ephemeral archaeological record of immigration or migrants crossing the border, and how important that work is. So my question is, how does Mary's legacy lead us to not to active archaeology, but even an active archaeology, activist archaeology, and for whom and how? Does her legacy propel us forward?
Thanks, Karen. It's kind of funny thinking of Mary as an activist or not. I think because she was sort of unfiltered to her students, and at the same time, she also, I think, curated herself a lot. So she played both sides of that. And I think we all heard about different obstacles that she faced, whether it was as an undergrad through blatant sexism, less blatant sexism, the issues of salary parity that I think her students heard about sometimes, which are really important issues to be exposed to and sort of be on the lookout for as you're creating these people who are going to go out into the workforce. And Mary also, she was always kind of on the front edge of knowing everything that was going on in our field. If you needed to know who was going to get a job before you found out that you did or didn't get the job, she somehow knew. And I think that she kind of was, the canary for all of us about what we could expect, what we might see coming down the pike. And I think that, her beloved NPR was the kind of left-wing voice that we were all served through our lab time. So yeah, I think that she would be amazed by the role of activist archaeology, and and was part of training people to speak up, to, as she quoted to me one time, not take things lying down, and to be an advocate for the work that you want to do and for the work that other people should get to do.
At the same time, I think she would have probably rejected the term activist. I don't know if she ever. I never heard her call it. I can't. It would be interesting to think through whether she would have self-identified as an activist. I think in many ways my conversations with Mary on these issues, it was more the sense that she wanted to see anti-racism and feminism as the norm. This is just what we all do. This is how the world should be. You can call that activism if you want, but I think there was a big part of Mary. I mean, yeah, there was the Cindy Sherman side that that you alluded to a moment ago, right? Absolutely, but fundamentally, there was an interest in powerful institutions and being able to shift the dial so things that were right were normal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think one of the things I appreciated with her was the way in which her lived experiences of whatever harassment and discrimination as a young student and young academic, she carried those with her and allowed them to inform how she then thought about what she was doing and how she interacted with her students and mentored other students and other young faculty. And it should go without saying really, but I see so many other women academics of that era and older, in fact, who went through all sorts of forms of discrimination and had all these forms of harassment, and whose response has been, I had to deal with it, you have to deal with it, right? And it was lovely to have someone older, of an older generation like that, who didn't respond in that way, who was absolutely committed to her feminism and to sort of living that out in practice.
I think they've covered, yeah.
Yes, thank you. You all had fantastic presentations. Thank you. It was like amazing. And
We're having trouble hearing.
I'm so sorry. You all had fantastic presentations. They were wonderful and insightful and everything. And I want to, this, all of this, of course, is asking about the immaterial and the temporary, especially. And this is to Carolyn too. And this also extends to all of you because it does get to the points. But specifically, how did you see people grapple with the temporary? Burning Man involved the creation of stuff, and at the end, the destruction, cleanup, and the disappearance of it all. And they knew that this was going to happen, but they still spent all this time creating and building, and then it all just disappeared. And how do you yourselves too deal with acceptance of the temporary? And how do you do your best to, I guess, teach it before it permanently disappears?
Well, I think one thing about Burning Man that I find very interesting is it is temporary. This is a city that exists for a single week, but it also comes back year after year. So when you show up at Burning Man in consecutive years, it's almost like it's been there the entire time. So that is a weird thing about Burning Man. Its temporariness and its longevity, including, people pack up all their stuff, stick it in a storage space, and then bring the same stuff out year after year. And I think in looking at these other so-called temporary spaces and seeing the trajectory of those what will be a short-lived space. I mean, I don't think that people anticipate largely that something is temporary. People build out things within the resources that they have. And there's an incredible amount of investment in things that are wasteful. I mean, we can see this absolutely everywhere. There's this kind of, I talk about in the book, this kind of effervescence of life where people use up material they have, accumulate things, and and just kind of burn them off quite literally at Burning Man, but everywhere else there are those kinds of things. Andrea spoke of the waste that we saw in the privy at Spencer Pierce Little. I mean, archaeologists our trade is on the things that people throw away. And so we recreate the past through the things that people abandon. And it's through those objects that Mary is able to see that this many people came to dinner and look at how did they need, all of these chamber pots in a single house. It's because people accumulate excess and then they move and all the stuff goes into the privy. So I'm not sure if that fully answered your question, but it's fascinating to think of our own homes as these temporary lodgings that where all this stuff will have to go somewhere at some point. And the way that we do or don't prepare for that is really interesting.
Something that, sorry, I interrupted.
And say, there's going to be a reception and you're going to get a chance to talk to people. And as we have learned, every moment is an ephemeral moment in a cycle. And this one has come to its natural closure, but it will live in our thoughts and memories, and we will relive it at the reception that is following, and it remains to us only to thank our marvelous speakers so much.
Thank you. Thank you.